I wrote Thurman a long letter, and I was going through a terrible trial. And I said, Doc, I'm not sure what I should do next. Should I do a PhD or should I go on to law school where I have some real interest? He basically told me I was like a little boy sitting on a Christmas tree with a lot of gifts and didn't know which one to open. And then he said, but you must, and this famous word, you must wait and listen for the sound of the genuine that is within you. When you hear it, that will be your voice, and that will be the voice of God. We hardly know the grief of our suffering, and certainly among Black people, but it's true for all of us. As you think of the cosmic we and this universal moan, even creation is moaning. Why shouldn't we?
This podcast explores the mystery of relatedness as an organizing principle of the universe and of our lives.
We are trying to catch a glimpse of connections beyond color, continent, country, or kinship through science, mysticism, spirituality, and the creative arts. I'm Donny Bryant.
I'm Barbara Holmes, and this is The Cosmic We. We are delighted to have Dr. Walter Fluker with us today, a scholar, a friend, a theological giant in the field. His resume is far too extensive to share here, but I do want you to know that he was born in Valden, Mississippi, in a section affectionately referred to as Frog Bottom. Near his hometown is the town where Fannie Lou Hamer sustained that merciless beating. Also nearby is the place where Oprah Winfrey grew up. Dr. Fluker is a UCC minister, served as a chaplain in the Army and for universities, graduated from Trinity College in philosophy and biblical studies, received his Master's of Divinity from Garrett Evangelical, and his PhD from Boston University. He has served as professor at Vanderbilt, Colgate Rochester Crozer Divinity, Morehouse, and Boston University, his alma mater. Hello, Dr. Fluker.
Hello.
So glad to see you.
I'm so glad to see you and to be seen.
I think the last time we were together was at the opening of the first book in the Thurman Papers series. I looked around and all 5 were finished. It was amazing. Tell us a little bit about your history. Tell us about how you grew up and what it was like in Valden, Mississippi.
Well, I was born in Vaden, Mississippi.
Vaden, thank you for that correction.
And it was near Winona in Mississippi. Everything is near some other big town. And Winona was the place where most of the migrants going north, points north, were able to take the train north. And in 1956, my daddy took that train running from Mr. Johann and the plantation economy of Mississippi and sent for his children, my brother, Beatrice, and my mom, Zetty, to meet with my 2 older sisters who had already escaped. And so I took the city of New Orleans, that train that has carried many a thousands, to Chicago. And I grew up on the south side of Chicago in a neighborhood that Oscar Brown Jr. used to say where the people don't live so good, where the rooms are small and the buildings are made of wood. And we were members of a little storefront church, Centennial Missionary Baptist Church. And I'm still ordained Baptist. But I grew up in that small storefront church where people would stand up and give their testimony. And my mother's testimony each Tuesday night, no matter what we were doing, she would make us go to church. And we would hear this litany, which was hers. I just rose to give you my testimony. The Lord has been good to me. He's brought me from a mighty long way, etc., etc. And finally, she said, and Lord, it's hard raising these children, but I've placed them in the hands of the Lord, and I know that you are able to keep them from falling. That was my mama. And she was an usher. I write about her in the book, The Ground Is Shifted, but she was a arthritic, illiterate, but she knew Jesus in the pardon of her sins. Earl Fluker. And my daddy was not a churchgoer. I think it was mainly because of the kind of respectability associated with going to church on Sunday. He'd need a suit and he'd have to act proper and all that stuff. And that wasn't Daddy's way of being in the world. He was a very wonderfully beautiful human being. I mean, physically and a personality-wise, just very, very wonderful person, quiet often. And both mom and dad were certainly of African descent, but there's a strong Choctaw Native American vein in our family. There's a little town in the northeast corner of Louisiana. Its name is Fluker.
Really?
And
you get around.
and so I was born about 2 hours from there, driving. But I'm sure, I'm convinced that is the plantation out of which many of the Flukers whom you'll meet around the country had their origins in this plantation economy.
Wow. My goodness. You, before we move away from the ancestors and the elders, I want to ask you about your grandmother.
Oh, Lord.
Your grandmother, Ma, you mentioned, was a medicine woman. Born with the veil, just like Howard Thurman. And for those who don't know what that means, it means you see to the other side.
You can see things.
Yes, sir.
Her name, we called her affectionately Ma. That's the way it's really pronounced, because it's that pidgin of this Creole mixture in Louisiana, but Ma. And Ma didn't take any stuff off white people or black people or anybody. She was fearless, and my folks would always say the white folks called her a crazy nigger because she didn't take no stuff. There's a legend in the family, whether it's true or not. They came to take our family's goods when my father was working on the Mississippi levee, when the levee broke. And the boss man came to take away our goods, the refrigerator, we call it Frigidaire in Mississippi. Take away the Frigidaire, and the cow. And they said Mom walked out with her shotgun cocked, put her feet, boot really, on the fender of the truck, and said, Mr. Waller, whatever his name was, but Waller is what I remember. I can spend the rest of my time in hell. How about you?
She must have known my grandmother, because
well, those are my people.
I come from stock just like that.
Oh, yeah. And Mo was a midwife. She took care of a lot of the medicinal needs of of the people, the residents in the area where my folks grew up. And most importantly, as you mentioned, she could see things. I have early memories of her being stern and sweet, if there's a combination. She smoked Pall Malls, and she drank whiskey out of the side of her mouth, as she did Coca-Cola. But just a powerful image that remains with me at all times. My mom and my mother. My father is very close to me as an ancestor, but when I'm in most trouble, my mother shows up. And I'm so glad I'm not bound by the academy nowadays. I can always tell my story the way I like to tell it. But
Free
I
at
just,
last.
yeah,
Free at
Praise
last.
God.
as they say in the church, hallelujah.
Hallelujah.
Anyway, but my mom and dad, they come to me in dreams and in vision. I've had visions of my mom when I was being assaulted, because I grew up bullied. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. You have to understand that. I was smart. I used to carry so many books, they'd laugh at me. Sometimes I'd have books on my head and others in my arm coming because I wanted to know things when I was young. And it was just it was untypical. There were other smarter than I, smart people, but you didn't show up in public doing that. So I was bullied and suffered through major gang violence, lost friends in gang wars. I was not a gang member. I went to church. It was my sanctuary. It was the place where we were able to live and breathe. But because of that history of violence and assault and being bullied, my folks always had a way of taking care of me, even though they were all so violently assaulted as Southerners in this strange new urban environment for them. But they show up now always as guides and comforters. I'll give you one quick example. This is a podcast, and I know you have time. But I'm a chronic sufferer of gout.
Okay.
And so was my mom, and it runs in the family. But once I had a huge problem with the gout attack, and I woke up, and there was my mama and Miss Henrietta. That was her best friend. Both were deceased by then, or whatever that means. But they were working on a tree. They were just showing me this tree and the bark of the tree, and that this would help my gout. I knew that's what it meant. So I went to a health food store after that, and I asked about remedies for gout and things associated with bark and trees. I've forgotten the name of the medicine. Boy, normally I know it, but I actually found some medicine there. And that's just one instance of the ways in which they show up. And they've helped me not just in the United States of America, but in travels all around the world. My mama, my daddy, and some other folks just show up. It's good to be crazy. It saves you from so many other things, from stilted reason.
I think that's the most sanity that we can adopt. I think the church has lost something when it lost its mysticism. When you think about George Floyd and the newspapers saying, oh, look, he's talking to his dead mother. He thinks his mother. No, his mother had crossed over earlier to be there when he was ready to transition. He wasn't making it up or going crazy. She was standing there.
I agree.
There's such a different view of what church means when you've got that.
Oh, Lord. Yeah. Can I say one or two other things? And I'll stop. I'll stop this trend.
No, don't stop. Don't stop.
But listen. I moved to Rochester in the late 80s, early 90s. My family and I, Sharon, our two boys, they were very young then. And I was going through this transformation. I had a deep sense. I was already thinking about doing something with Howard Thurman because I had met him and studied with him in the late 70s and did a dissertation on Thurman and King. But this was a little different. I had received a Mellon faculty fellowship at Harvard. I was teaching at Harvard. They were courting me. But Colgate Rochester showed up, and I went on there as Dean of Black Church Studies. That's the context. But during this period, I was going through it was kind of like a breakthrough. So much agony associated with this, you should know. And one day, my family and I walk into a bookstore, and books had started talking to me by then. And I walked straight up to the the counter, and there is a bookshelf that says, buy this, Malodoma Patrice Sommet of Water and Spirit.
And spirit.
I purchased the book, make a long story short, read it all night. And I said, wherever he is, I got to find him. So I pulled out my little Rolodex, couldn't find him. After long weeks of searching for Malodoma, I went into meditation, and I got up, went to my bookshelf, and there in my pile of notes, those little sticky notes that you think, I had picked up his number somewhere else because it was his number, Malodoma. And I called him and I said, hello, may I speak to Malodoma Patrice Sommet? He said, this is Malodoma. And that started a lifelong friendship. We're very good friends, but it was through Malodoma and then his wife, Sabonfu, that I was involved in a grief ritual on Cortes Island off Vancouver, British Columbia. And this island, all of these people from around the world were just going through these rituals. And on one evening, I'm making a very long story short, but one evening during what the Dagra people called the grief ritual, where we pay our debt to the ancestors through grief, through weeping and moaning, that universal moan. And so they told us, just be free. And, I'm kind of colored. I'm not just black. I'm kind of colored. He said, just be free. So they started playing the drum, and Sabonfu was hitting some kind of shaking instrument, and I just started getting down. Nobody there. I'm the only African American, you should know, but I was just getting down. And all at once, out of nowhere, my father is there.
Wow.
And I fell to my knees and I cried. I said, Daddy, we miss you. He had died in 1984. I had performed a eulogy, but never mourned him. I was too busy being me. And I said, Daddy, we miss you. Mama misses you. B misses you. I just went through the whole family. And when I came to myself, all of the women had taken me to a corner in the room, and they were rocking me. And this Japanese woman whispers in my ears, she says, you're only 5 years old. I didn't know what that meant then. It was years later when I discovered when Daddy left Mississippi in a hurry, he sent for us, thanks be to God. I was 5 years old. And I was still grieving my daddy's departure.
Oh, my goodness.
And that was one of the most healing moments in my life. And he was real, more real than even in life, real. So I have no doubt that ancestors not only exist, but they are present for us. They come to us in moments of great need and trial. And they also celebrate life's moments with us. They want to celebrate with us. And I'm thankful, I mentioned Malodoma, I'm thankful that it was he who introduced me to this grief ritual, which I have revised, and I use it often in workshops, especially with young Black males, because there's so much grief.
Tell us a little bit about that ritual.
Yeah, at Morehouse College, I was asked to become the head of the Leadership Center, or found the Leadership Center in Morehouse College. And so I had a laboratory where I could work things. And so these young men would come in a pre-college program. And what we would do, the way I revised it, was to play with the idea of Plato's allegory of the cave. And they'd get used to this and all that. But they would be in a room where they could anonymously speak their truth and share their grief. So someone else would say, I stand on behalf of my brother Clyde, and he was raped when he was 3 years old, and he's still struggling through this. And someone would speak on behalf of the other. And at the end, we would go through our grief ritual in front of the shrine of Howard Thurman at Morehouse College, if you've ever been on the campus, between Thurman and King. And they would call out any name they wanted to name themselves while they were grieving. But everybody, you didn't escape the moment of the deep emotion. And I learned over time, especially when I did this with South African young people, that I always needed a therapist, a clinical person on hand and available to make referrals, because we hardly know the grief of our suffering. And certainly among Black people, but it's true for all of us. As you think of the cosmic we and this universal moan, even creation is moaning. Why shouldn't we? You know. So that's the backdrop.
Dr. Fluker, it's just, for me, I'm in awe just receiving all of your wisdom. But you mentioned the influence of some of the ancestors, and from what I understand, and you can help us understand this, but Dr. Thurman's grandmother had great influence in his life and much of his perspective and much of how he viewed the world and his spirituality. Could you speak a little bit about that and how you understand how his forefathers, and particularly his grandmother, like your grandmother, had an influence in his life?
Nancy Ambrose, Grandma Nancy, anchor person, he called her, the anchor. I think she was the portal into the universe for young Howard. His mom was very important. Mother struggled a lot, as many women do, trying to raise children, et cetera, et cetera. But this Grandma Nancy, she was another person whom Thurman, being always careful to stay within the confines of quote unquote rationality and a certain kind of respectability, that he was a man of his time. He needed to use this language and always show the larger culture that he was as smart as they were. I don't think this was his deep personal need, but he knew he only had certain language, signs, and symbols where he could project this. But if you dig deep into his experience with Grandma Nancy, you begin to see that this was a woman who had experienced real travail. She never talked about the Mosley plantation. Thurman says that she kept this for herself, though she would visit once a year and she'd take young Howard with her. We've now traced the roots into South Carolina. And of course, Carolina is a major port for slaves. And we believe that Nancy was probably more associated with the Gullah people.
Dr. B shaking her hand.
Yeah. And, and so these Africanisms were and still are so much a part of the culture. I'm thinking about LaRonda's Manigault Bryant's book, Walking with the Dead. She talks about this experience. But so you have this kind of background with Grandma Nancy, and you also have Thurman in a community of not just formerly enslaved Africans, but people who had African retentions. When he's talking about community, he's not talking about some abstract conversation on the blackboard. These people were in relation, so that when one person suffered, they all suffered. He talks about the experience of his father's funeral and the death of his father, how all the community came together to care for him. And when they laid him out on the winding board, as these old traditions say, people came to visit, they would leave food. But this is a huge piece in Thurman's formation, so that by the time you hear him give you a hint, he gives you a lot of hints. When he's in Boston in 1958, and he says, I went to the mirror and Martin's face came before me. This is in 1958. King has just been stabbed by this mentally ill woman, and he's at the Harlem hospital. I don't know if Thurman knew this yet. But Thurman says he also noticed that there were some marks on his ears. where they had removed the veil. What is that? The amniotic veil
Yeah.
that. And this is certainly a tradition long-standing among shamans in different cultures, even in Siberian cultures. The people know that when you're born with this veil on your face, that you'll see things, but they remove it because they don't want you to get confused, because you're living in two worlds. And part of Thurman's work, therefore, I think, has to be interpreted in light of these retentions, this past. Now, I'm scooting over years, but all through his writings, there are places where he lets you know that he's into something else. A woman in Iowa he visits who gives him a word. He said he just had to see her because he'd heard so much about her. And when she finishes, this is an illiterate woman, by the way, when she finishes, she gives him a word that Thurman traces back to Plotinus.
Wow. Wow.
So this is the universe that he's a part, but he's also a modernist. And in many ways, a modernist liberal. So his theological language is more in alignment with modernism, but he is also speaking out of a well that isn't given public notice with Thurman.
Wow.
I think that's enough to say about that given time, but there's so much. And Anthony Sean Neal, I was trying to remember his name, is a young scholar in Mississippi State University, who is doing this kind of work. One of his books is called Fragmented Love, but he traces Thurman's lineage through his spiritual lineage through Grandma Nancy. And I think there ought to be some other work that's done there around the kind of deep spirituality that is also guiding him.
Yeah, absolutely.
You said you met him in the 70s. What was the occasion that you met Howard Thurman?
I was so gifted. I'm kind of like the Black Forrest Gump. I just show up and I don't know what I'm doing. Honestly, I just show up.
I don't believe that for a minute.
But one of the best things that ever happened to me, I met a young woman when I started seminary who was my next door neighbor. And she was just so gorgeous. It took the breath out of me when I first met her. It really did. And she was my next door neighbor. And one day, after 2 years, she finally invited me over to her apartment. And there in her apartment was a big broadside that says, as long as a man has a dream in his heart, he cannot lose the significance of living. Mm-hmm. Wow. That young woman and I be married 40 years this month. That was Sharon Watson. She was working on her PhD at Northwestern, and I was entering seminary. And my Lord, that Howard Thurman was her godfather. I had read Thurman earlier, and it's just, I had read Thurman earlier when I was a chaplain's assistant, but I had no idea of where my life was leading me. And so it was through the Watsons, Sharon's parents, who were very distinguished members of the Atlanta community. I really married way up. And that I first had the chance to meet Howard and Sue Bailey Thurman in their living room. And it was just, oh God, he was so funny. All I can remember is that they were so funny. They laughed at everything. There wasn't anything off the table that they wouldn't laugh at.
You don't get that impression when you hear him talking on YouTube.
Oh God, he was hilarious. Everything was funny to him. And I shared with a group yesterday, most great spiritual teachers, leaders are laughing. A sure sign, because they're laughing at the fragility of our finitude and how we take ourselves so seriously. And Thurman, Tutu, Dalai Lama, watch them,
Yeah.
Just laughing their heads off. Anyway, and that was my experience of meeting Thurman. And later I was invited to study with him as a group of students organized by Luther E. Smith and others who were meeting with Thurman during those days. And I was the first, ours was the first cohort of 6 men and 4 women, all devoted to the religious life. And we sat with Thurman for an entire week. And it was life-changing. That's not even the word for me, but no one spent that kind of time with Howard Thurman and just walked away and flubbed their hand. We begged him to stay. We're in San Francisco, and we begged him at the end, can we stay? We'll clean, we'll cook. and he spat out his coffee laughing at us. It was so funny.
Have you ever written about that time?
I did something for Gregory Ellison's, but it was short. So I'm doing some memoirs now.
Oh, good.
And that's why some of this stuff is fresh for me, because I've forgotten most of these things. But Thurman, I started writing him, right? And I was in seminary. I didn't really want to be a preacher. I got tired of, these abstract theological conversations. But I'd make my living off that. I didn't know that. That's how I'd make my living. But anyway, but I had the restlessness of many seminarians. And I wrote Thurman a long letter. And I was going through a terrible trial. But I wrote him a long letter and I said, Doc, I'm not sure what I should do next. Should I do a PhD or should I go on to law school where I have some real interest? And he wrote me back in what seemed like a millennium, hand-delivered letter to me. It was hand-delivered, written in his hand, and with doodles all in the margins, He's laughing the whole time. And hieroglyphics, the language was like hieroglyphics. But I read through it, and very quickly, he basically told me I was like a little boy sitting on a Christmas tree with a lot of gifts and didn't know which one open.
Wow.
And then he said, but you must, and this famous word that you now see broadcast everywhere because of Oprah Winfrey's interest in it, you must wait and listen for the sound of the genuine that is within you. When you hear it, that will be your voice, and that will be the voice of God. I had no idea what he meant, but it just felt good, right? And one mailing day later, I get 3 letters in the mail. The first 2 I can't even tell you about. I'll write about it when I go and be with the ancestors. But the first 2 were letters asking for forgiveness. And oh, I cried. And the last one was a letter of acceptance from Boston University. I was so sure about Boston University, I had no doubt in my mind. I left with my parents' little gift of $115. They wanted to buy me a robe. I'd just been ordained. I said, no, I could use this money. and everything just fell in place. And I had no idea that I'd be going to Boston. 2 years later, Thurman would pass on. A year and a half later, he'd pass on. And Sue Bailey Thurman would send the bulk of his materials to Boston University. And so I had opportunity to go into the papers even before they were cataloged, to write a dissertation. I was only going to write a dissertation on Thurman, but my advisor, bless his heart, told me that I'd have to do it on Thurman and King because there was not enough in Thurman to justify a dissertation. I knew differently, but I wanted the PhD. I'd invested all. So I just wrote 2 dissertations.
A wise decision, Dr. Fluker.
Oh, Lord. Many are the troubles of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him or her out of them all.
Well, Dr. Fluker, I almost want to just for you to have you elaborate a little more on this idea of silence and listening to that inner voice. And for what I understand, that Dr. Thurman had these habits of stillness that oftentimes we don't hear about or we don't necessarily know. And so I wanted to see if you can elaborate a little bit more about your insights about his habits of stillness and how he practiced, silence in order to hear.
Listen to this, and you may have heard it before. It shows up in a lot of his public addresses. "In quietness and in confidence shall be your strength." Long before you were born, God was at work creating the worlds of nature, people, and things. God is not finished with creation. God is not finished with you. And he goes on and on. So this notion of quiet, I think, was native to Thurman's personality, or indigenous to his way of being in the world. He needed quiet. He tells you that in his autobiography. And sometimes life's challenges push you into stillness. So this young man who's had a really, I think, traumatic experience growing up, not just with his father's death, which is the major piece, but he tells you that he was not welcome to games by the other kids, that he was not, he didn't get the company of the young women. He was awkward, he said. So even he said when he got nervous, his right toe would rub against his left heel. So he needed quietness and a place, and this comes up in his language later, a place that he could call his own. It's a strange freedom to run up and down the streets of other minds where no salutation greets, and there's no place to call your own. And so silence for Thurman is his entree into a space that he could call his own. And it's the indwelling space for many of us who studied Thurman. It's the indwelling space of what could be called, he calls it presence, but it's divine intelligence. It's knowing. It's very intimate knowing, because one both knows and is known. And for Thurman, it's most important to be known. You know, what does it feel like to be a young black man at the turn of the 20th century in Daytona Beach, Florida, where nobody knows your name? and to have the stillness of the Halifax River, to watch the raging storm spread across the Atlantic, and to find solace in an old oak tree where he goes to commune. And he's talking to the tree. I laugh always when I say that this is a real conversation. And so silence for Thurman is not the absence of noise. And I think most of us know this. It's not the absence, because he finds it in the storm. It's more akin to what many ancient myths and philosophies refer to as the abyss or the void. There's this hole in existence. this I don't want to go black hole. I don't know enough about it. But there's something in existence that is necessary for life to be generated. And so Thurman was, I think, this is a Fluker interpretation, I think he was looking for this thing which he experienced within himself, but was also manifested in many ways in what he eschewed, but nonetheless metaphysical terms. It's this dimension, much like the Buddhist coin that says the utility of a bowl is its emptiness. So to find this still point, Merton loved to call it the centering moment, the steel point. He called it, and that le point de verge, I know I'm getting the French wrong, but it's really the virgin point. It's that which is untested. Yeah, that which is untested. And so experience means that you kind of get some on you if you show up in the world and and you have experience. And so his interpretation of the Garden of Eden, you see it in his book, The Search for Common Ground. Adam and Eve, when they receive knowledge, they get kicked out of the garden because they've been untested before then. He gives a psychological, a kind of psychocultural interpretation of this myth, and they're kicked out of the garden. And when they return, there's a huge angel there with a flaming sword. Thurman uses the imagery of George Fox, the angel with a flaming sword. But it's this angel, if you get by this angel, one cannot pass this angel with the flame, because you know what the sword is going to do. It's going to dismember you, cut you asunder. And so the only way one returns to paradise lost after innocence is the quest Thurman calls for goodness or wholeness or harmony. So one can never be innocent again, which is, I'm referencing this void, so to speak, and life becoming integrated and whole. One must pass this. And he said, you cannot lay it upon that altar without the fluid area of your consent. One chooses. So there's no substitute savior there. There's nobody there going to save you. You got the angel to deal with. And when I work with young brothers and sisters, I say, you're going to get your ass jacked up if you go see the angel. If you go past the angel, but that's what spiritual maturity is about, because this doesn't happen once. For those who dare to make that journey, you don't get saved one time and then you fix. No. This is, you got to deal with you got to tussle with the angel. And this angel is so much a part of your becoming. And you cannot avoid it for Thurman.
Wow.
Can I try to interpret that in the Donny Bryant interpretation? Because that was so real and deep. So Dr. Fluker, correct me. I want to do this for people who, because what you said was so weighty and so heavy, and I want to try to just rephrase it and correct if I'm wrong. So are you saying that for much of Thurman's work and understanding is that the journey to wholeness, the pathway to becoming, the reality of life, or the spiritual transformation, the spiritual journey is a pathway that has to go through suffering, darkness?
It's the most dominant theme in all of Thurman's thought. You cannot read Thurman or read his life or his work without suffering is a discipline of the spirit for Thurman. And so tragedy, the exigencies of existence for Thurman are given. And if you want to get home, you got to pass this angel. Well, if you're preaching, Barbara, you could do something with that, couldn't you?
I sure could. That will preach.
That'll preach.
Yeah, this is not a friendly. Wow. I think sometimes it's associated with Uriel. There's a huge portrait. I've forgotten the American artist, but you might find it's Uriel taking a rest. This huge portrait is also at the Boston University Gottlieb Center, where you have this angel, but he's there with his sword. And I would be there going through the papers, and there was Uriel behind me. And I became more and more aware when I really delved into the Quaker thought and George Fox, what Thurman was doing with this imagery. But for him, it's precisely that one is dismembered in order to be remembered. When I do ethical leadership training, I talk about remembering, retelling, and reliving one story. But you cannot be remembered until you acknowledge the dismemberment of your being. And life will dismember you if you show up here on the planet with the rest of us.
And that's why lament and grieving It should be so much a part of our journey. We don't acknowledge that we are being dismembered as we go.
And I want to get home so badly, Barbara.
Me too.
Yeah, I just want to get home. I just want to get home. Malodoma tickles me. He says, if you want to get home, you got to give somebody a ride.
Yeah, because we don't get home alone. We get home together.
I'm going to stop after this because I know you all have livings, but I had another thought that I had to tell you. I told you I'm kind of like Forrest Gump. Honestly, that's a good analogy for me. I show up in South Africa with these students, Oprah Winfrey scholars. Miss Winfrey gave us a lot of money to take these young men. They were Morehouse men at that point. But we'd have co-eds by the time we built the program, made sure we put women and everybody else in there. But at this first, we were taking these young men, and I met Baba Credo Muchwa. If that's not a name that you should know at some point. Baba means Papa.
Right.
Credo Muchwa, Zulu shaman. He passed this past year. One of the most important figures in this African spirituality, but everybody all over the world would come and see Baba. I didn't know who I was meeting. So after I met him, I could pick it up, right? Yeah. And I said, I'd like to spend some time with you. He said, well, let me know when you're ready, Prof. And I make this journey to see him while I'm there. And I meet him on in a little shanty. Remind me of the places in Mississippi. They had the little chickens all over the yard. And I'm stepping over chickens trying to get in. And I go and sit down. His wife comes out. And she was very British in protocol. She said, you care for tea, Prof? I said, oh, yeah, but I'm looking at this wood-burning stove right in the middle of the room, and there are all these strange pieces of art, deep iconographic things, like space people, stuff like that. I didn't know and then Baba comes out, but unlike the time I met him, in all of his shamanistic gear. And I said, yeah. I said, what I done got myself into? And boy, do you know, he said, how can I help you, Prof? And a dream immediately shot into my mind that I had early in the 90s of chasing a little creature into a cave. I had this strange dream that troubled me for all this time. So I told him about the dream. He said, oh, I know that little man. He said, I know him. And he told me his name. Wow. Now he could have been just pulling my leg, but I'm so glad he did, because he named for me this journey. I was trying to get into the cave to catch this guy. And I learned later that this cave is the domain of a lot of these folks. They go to the caves, the cave of the heart, But this cave is where so much of this work is done. So when I look for the place nowadays that I call my own, I go to the cave. And I sit there in silence, and I wait and listen to receive whatever I need. Doesn't every now and then it comes. But I'll sit and I'll wait in the cave, because I think that we have so much more that is available to us beyond the confines of institutionalized religion and faith. There's so much more that's being offered to us if we'd only dare let go and let the stream take us where it will. But we're so frightened that we might get lost or we might not be saved. And we're already lost and not saved. So this one.
And clutching at nothing.
That's all I got, y'all. I know that's
oh my goodness, this has been so rich, so powerful. Dr. Fluker.
It is
Who
I.
are you?
It is I. Be not afraid.
I mean, I'm a Gullah woman from South Carolina, and I just have such affinity with everything you've been talking about.
Yeah, you know those trees, don't you?
Oh, yes, I do. And how to work roots.
Oh, Lord, ain't nothing like a good root.
Thank you so much. I mean, I didn't get to, but we'll get to it at some point. One of the finest books I've ever read is The Ground Has Shifted.
Wow.
The Future of the Black Church in Post-Racial America.
Ooh.
I love this book. I recommend it. Buy it, read it, and consider all of the issues that Dr. Fluker raises about the possibility of post-racialism. I don't know if you still believe that's possible. But I want to leave our listeners with the mysticism, the conjuring, the storytelling, and the remembering. Thank you for everything, Dr. Fluker.
Blessings on you.
And you also.
And Donny, what a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to meet you.
Thank you. Thanks for listening. We want to leave you with a few reflections from our conversation with Dr. Walter Fluker.
One of the things he said really struck a note with me. I love to claim my mysticism and my Gullah culture, but I've become very westernized in the way that I hide grief. I have no options for lament, much like the culture that I'm surrounded by. And his discussion of the grief ritual with the Dagara people was really quite astounding.
Yeah, that conversation was eye-opening. And his story about seeing his father resonated with me also, Barbara, as I also have experienced grief. I guess the question is for our listeners, and the connection and the reflection that I would encourage us to experience and to look into is what trauma, what healing, what hurt, what pain that we need to be healed from could benefit from the practice of our own unique grief ritual.
Yes, and how can the organized religious institutions, the churches, and the places where we assemble to finally shed some of our arrogance, how can they help us to grieve, to lament, to begin to get free? Now, all of that was quite amazing. What are you grieving, those of you who are listening? What are you grieving that you don't know that you're grieving? How will you process that grief? Thanks so much for being with us today.